It was 5 years ago, and we still remember that night at the lake house. We needed a break from the chaos of city life, a quiet retreat. Just the three of us, me, my brother Jason, and our best friend Mark. We had found a secluded lake house online, nestled deep in the woods. No neighbors, no traffic, just the endless glassy water and the whisper of the trees. The drive was long, winding through dense forests that seemed to close in the further we went. A few miles before the lake house, we stopped at the only store we'd seen for miles. An old roadside grocery, the kind that smelled of dust and old wood, with a single aging man behind the counter. We grabbed some snacks, beer, and firewood, laughing about the weekend ahead. But when we mentioned where we were going, the old man's smile faded. He stared at us, his milky blue eyes clouding with something unreadable. "That lake house?" he muttered. "You boys watch yourselves." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Why?" The old man was silent for a moment, then sighed, shaking his head. "There are stories about the ghosts of 2 children. They say they drowned out there looking for their mother, and now they look for someone else to take her place." Jason chuckled, rolling his eyes. "Sounds like a campfire story." But the old man didn't laugh. He just stared, lips pressing into a thin line before he muttered, "Just be careful." We shrugged it off and left, but an unease settled over us as we continued driving. The road became narrower, the trees closing in tighter, until finally we arrived at the lake house. It was beautiful, rustic, but well-maintained. A wooden deck stretched over the still water, reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. We unpacked, cracked open some beers, and sat by the lake, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, the silence peaceful. But as night fell, that peace shifted into something else. Jason was the first to notice it. "Did you hear that?" he asked, head tilting slightly. I listened. At first, nothing. Just the gentle lapping of water against the dock. And then, a faint splash, like someone had stepped into the water. We all turned toward the lake, but there was nothing. Just the empty shore, the moon casting silver ribbons across the surface. Mark laughed. "Probably a fish." We agreed, but something about it felt wrong. Later that night, as we sat around the fireplace inside, the atmosphere grew heavier. The house had grown colder, the air thick with something I couldn't name. Then, from the window overlooking the lake, I saw it. 2 figures, standing ankle-deep in the water. Jason must have seen them too, because he went still beside me. Mark, oblivious, kept talking, but his words faded into background noise. The figures didn't move, didn't wade further. They just stood, staring at the house, at us. Then, they stepped back into the water and vanished beneath the surface. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their silhouettes, their dark, empty faces staring. At some point, exhaustion took over, but then, a whisper. "Mama." Distant. My eyes snapped open. The room was pitch black. My heart hammered in my chest. Then, a sound from outside, a soft, wet slapping against the wooden deck. Footsteps. I held my breath. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate. Then, something pressed against the glass. I didn't want to turn. I didn't want to see. But I did. And there, a small, pale hand, sliding slowly down the window. I gasped, scrambling upright. Jason and Mark jolted awake. "What the hell was that?" Jason muttered. I pointed to the window. The hand was gone, but the condensation from the cold night air revealed the faint outline of small fingerprints. That was it. We decided to leave first thing in the morning. As we packed up at dawn, Jason went to the car first. Then he stopped, frozen. "Guys," he called, his voice shaking. We rushed over. Our car, it was covered in wet footprints, leading up to the driver's side, but none leading away. Then came the whisper.
Mama.
Closer this time, then a soft tapping on the car window. I turned my head slowly, my breath hitching in my throat. Through the glass, barely visible in the dim morning light, a face, pale, hollow-eyed, lips blue, dripping wet hair clinging to its forehead, and it was smiling. We ran. We didn't care about our bags. We didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. Jason fumbled with the keys, cursing under his breath. The engine roared to life, tires skidding on the gravel. As we peeled out of there, I risked one last glance at the lake house, and there, standing on the dock, two figures, dripping, watching, smiling. Even now, I still dream about that night. I still wake up hearing the whispers, feeling the cold touch of that hand against the glass. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I pass by a lake, I see them, standing in the water, waiting.
Mama.
It happened 2 years ago. Sometimes I tell myself it was just a bad dream, that it couldn't have been real. But every time I close my eyes, I see that night all over again. It started when my fiancé, Ethan, and I decided to spend a weekend at his late uncle's lake house. The place had been in his family for generations, sitting alone on the quiet banks of Lake Lanier. It was old, creaky, and smelled like damp wood, but it was peaceful. No neighbors, no distractions. Just us and the water stretching endlessly under the pale moonlight. We arrived late on a Friday evening after a long drive. Too tired to explore, we ate a quick dinner, had a drink by the dock, and went to bed. The lake was eerily still that night. No crickets, no frogs, just silence. The next morning, Ethan was excited to take out his uncle's old motorboat. It had been sitting in the boathouse for years, covered in dust and cobwebs. Something about it unsettled me. Maybe the way it rocked slightly, though there was no wind, or how the water around it seemed darker, thicker. But Ethan was determined. As we prepped the boat, I noticed something scratched into the wood near the throttle. "Never take her after dark." I frowned, running my fingers over the jagged letters. "Ethan, look at this." He glanced over and shrugged. "Probably some old superstition. You know how people talk about this lake." And he was right. Lake Lanier had a reputation, a long, bloody history of accidents, drownings, and missing persons. Locals whispered about spirits lurking beneath the surface, reaching up with cold, dead hands. I never believed in ghost stories. Not until that night. We spent most of the day cruising around, laughing, and soaking in the sun. The water was surprisingly deep, a perfect mirror of the sky. But as the sun started setting, a thick fog rolled in, fast. It swallowed the shore, leaving us surrounded by a wall of gray. The engine sputtered, then silence. The boat bobbed listlessly, the waves lapping like distant whispers. Then, a sound, faint but deliberate, like fingers drumming against the hull from underneath. I grabbed Ethan's arm. "Did you hear that?" He frowned. "It's probably..." Closer this time. The air grew dense, heavy. My skin prickled as if something unseen was watching us. I peered over the edge, and that's when I saw it. A hand, pale, bloated, gripping the side of the boat. I screamed. Ethan lurched forward, but by the time he looked, it was gone. The water was still. Too still. "We need to get back." My voice trembled. "Now!" Ethan tried the engine again. Nothing. His hands shook as he kept turning the key, muttering curses under his breath. The fog thickened. I could barely see my own hands. Then, the whispering started. Soft at first, a woman's voice, singing. No words, just a melody, drifting through the mist like a forgotten lullaby. Then a splash. Something was moving in the water. Many somethings. I grabbed Ethan's arm. Do not look. But he already had, his face drained of color. There's someone in the water. I didn't want to see. I really didn't. But my eyes betrayed me. And there they were. Dozens of figures, barely visible in the mist, half submerged, watching, motionless. Then, they moved. Their heads jerked unnaturally, snapping toward us in perfect unison. Their eyes, empty black pits, locked onto mine. The boat began to rock violently, unseen hands slamming against the sides. Ethan finally got the engine roaring to life. We took off, speeding blindly through the fog, the figures vanishing behind us. The second we broke through the mist and saw the lake house lights, the whispers stopped. The water stilled. We didn't sleep that night. I locked every door, every window. But the house, it felt wrong. At 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps on the deck. Slow, wet footsteps. I shook Ethan awake. The footsteps stopped. Then, something at the window. Ethan reached for the flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the dark. And there, standing just outside the glass, was a woman. Her skin was gray and waterlogged, her hair hanging in limp strands. Her mouth stretched too wide, her lips curling into something that wasn't a smile. She raised one hand and pressed her fingertips to the glass. Water pooled at her feet. Then, in a voice that didn't belong in this world, she whispered,
"You took my boat. Now I take you."
We left at sunrise. Didn't pack. Didn't stop. Just ran. We never spoke about it again, never went back. But sometimes when I'm near water, I hear it, that soft, distant melody. And I know she's still waiting.